Daniel lived in a small rented house at the end of a quiet street, and most evenings felt the same to him. He worked during the day, came home before sunset, washed his hands, and made simple food in a silent kitchen. He did not invite people over, and he did not talk much with neighbors, and he kept his life small on purpose. He told himself that calm was better than noise, and he told himself that the past belonged far away from this door. On that particular evening the air felt cooler, and the sky looked pale like it wanted to rest early. Daniel sat on his old sofa with a cup of tea, and he tried to focus on a small book he had read many times. The words did not stay in his mind, because his thoughts kept moving in circles, and his chest felt tight in a way he could not explain. He stood up and checked the window, then checked the lock, then returned to his seat, and he felt silly for acting like someone was coming. A soft knock came, gentle but clear, and Daniel froze for a moment. He did not hear footsteps after the knock, and he did not hear any voice calling his name, and that made him more uneasy. He walked to the door slowly, and his hand rested on the handle as if it needed permission to move. He took a breath and opened the door, expecting a neighbor or a wrong address, and his eyes tried to understand what he was seeing. Two people stood there, a woman and a young girl, and both looked tired from travel and waiting. The woman held her bag close to her side, and the girl stood half behind her, gripping the edge of the woman's coat. Their faces were calm but nervous, and their eyes were fixed on Daniel like they had carried this moment for a long time. Daniel felt the world tilt inside him, because he recognized them without needing to be told. The woman's eyes filled with tears that did not fall, and her lips trembled before she spoke. She said his name in a quiet voice, like she was afraid the sound would break the moment. Daniel's mouth went dry, and his thoughts ran back through years in one sudden wave. The girl stepped forward a little, and her gaze moved from his face to his hands, like she was checking if he was real. Daniel could not speak right away, and he felt his heart beat faster than it had in years. He had tried to bury that night deep inside himself, and he had tried to pretend it was only a dream he could not control. He remembered rain on glass, and a lonely road, and the smell of smoke mixing with wet air. He remembered the fear in a child's voice, and the way a woman held her close like she was the only thing left in the world. He remembered his own hands shaking as he helped them, and he remembered leaving quickly because he could not stand the attention that would come after. The woman took a small step closer, and her voice stayed soft and careful. She introduced herself as Mira, and then she placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said the girl's name was Lila. Daniel nodded, because his throat still felt tight, and his mind still felt like it was catching up. Mira said they had looked for him for years, and she said they had promised each other they would not stop, even when it felt impossible. Daniel moved aside and opened the door wider, because standing outside felt wrong, and because he could not hold the moment at the doorway forever. Mira hesitated, then stepped inside, and Lila followed with small careful steps. Daniel closed the door gently, and the sound of the latch felt louder than it should. They stood in the narrow hallway, and Daniel realized his home had never held visitors like this, and it felt like the walls were listening. He led them to the living room, and they sat on the sofa while Daniel took the chair across from them. The lamplight was warm but weak, and the room looked plain, with simple furniture and no photos on the walls. Mira looked around once, then looked back at Daniel, and her eyes showed both gratitude and sadness. Lila sat with her hands in her lap, and she watched Daniel closely, not smiling, not afraid, just focused. Daniel finally found his voice, and he asked how they found him, and the words came out rough but honest. Mira took a breath and began to explain, and her tone sounded like someone telling a story that still mattered every day. She said the night of the accident changed everything for them, and she said it was not only about survival, but about what came after. She said she lost many things in that period, and she had to rebuild her life piece by piece. She said Daniel's help became a turning point, because it showed her that she could keep moving forward, even when she felt alone. Daniel listened with his hands clasped together, and he tried to stay steady. He did not want to cry, and he did not want to look away, because he felt he owed them his full attention. He asked why they never reached out before, and Mira answered that they had tried, but they had no name, no address, and no clear path. She said they only knew his face and his voice, and she said he left before anyone could take details. She said they waited and searched, and they kept a small notebook of clues, and they followed every lead with hope. Lila finally spoke, and her voice was calm and clear, and it surprised Daniel because it carried confidence. She said she remembered him, and she said the memory did not fade even when the years passed. She said she remembered the way he spoke gently to her, and she said he told her to keep her eyes on him and to breathe slowly. She said she remembered his jacket and the smell of rain, and she said she remembered thinking he looked scared too, but he still helped them. Daniel swallowed hard, because he had not expected the child to remember so much. Mira reached into her bag and pulled out a folded letter, and she placed it on the table between them. She said she wrote it years ago, and she said she kept it safe because she believed she would meet him again. She said the letter carried what she could not say on that night, and she said it also carried what Lila wanted to say when she grew older. Daniel stared at the letter, and he felt the weight of it like a stone, because he realized this was not just a visit, it was a return of something unfinished. Daniel did not open the letter yet, because he was not ready for the full storm of feelings. He looked at Mira and Lila, and he saw how travel and time had shaped them, but he also saw strength in both of them. He realized they were not here to blame him, and they were not here to take anything from him. They were here to close a gap, to connect a broken line, and to place gratitude where silence had been. Outside, the street stayed quiet, and inside, the room felt full for the first time in years. Daniel took a slow breath and nodded, and he said they could stay for tea, because the night was still young. Myra's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Lila's eyes softened for a moment. Daniel went to the kitchen, and as he filled the kettle with water, he understood one clear thing. The past did not always stay buried, and sometimes it returned gently, carrying a second chance in its hands. Daniel poured water into the kettle and placed it on the stove, and the quiet sounds of the kitchen felt heavier than before. He listened to the soft movements from the living room, and he wondered how a single knock had changed the balance of his peaceful routine. His hands moved slowly, because his thoughts were crowded with memories and questions he never prepared answers for. Mira sat on the sofa and held her bag on her lap, and she watched the room as if it carried meaning beyond furniture and walls. Lila leaned slightly forward, her eyes moving carefully, taking in every detail of the space. This house felt like a reflection of Daniel, simple, quiet, and guarded, and that made Mira feel both comforted and sad. Daniel returned with 3 cups and placed them on the table, and the steam rose gently into the air. He sat down across from them, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence was not empty, but full of unspoken feelings, and each of them felt it pressing lightly against their chest. Mira broke the quiet by thanking Daniel again, and her voice sounded steady but emotional. She said she never imagined this moment would actually happen, and she said she had pictured it many times in her mind. She said sometimes she believed he was only a memory created by fear and hope, and sometimes she believed he was out there living a life far from theirs. Sitting in front of him now made everything real. Daniel nodded and looked into his cup, and he said he never expected to see them again either. He admitted that after that night, he thought about them often, especially during storms or long drives. He said he hoped they were safe and happy, but he also said he feared meeting them again, because he did not know how to explain why he disappeared. Lila listened closely, and when Daniel finished speaking, she asked him a simple question. She asked why he chose to help them when he could have kept driving. Her voice was calm, not accusing, just curious, like someone trying to understand the shape of the past. Daniel took a slow breath and answered honestly. He said he did not think about choice that night, and he said he only reacted to what he saw. He said he heard a child crying and a woman calling for help, and he said his body moved before his fear could stop him. He said sometimes people act without knowing why, and later they spend years wondering who they became in that moment. Mira listened with deep attention, and she said that moment defined much of her life afterward. She said after the accident, she felt broken and unsure of herself, and she said she struggled to trust the future. She said remembering that a stranger stopped and helped them gave her strength when days felt unbearable. She said it reminded her that kindness existed even when life felt cruel. Daniel felt a heavy warmth in his chest as he listened, and he realized he never allowed himself to see the impact of his actions. He had always focused on what he avoided instead of what he gave. Hearing Mira speak shifted something inside him, and he felt both relief and regret at the same time. Lila reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, and she placed it carefully on the table. She said this notebook traveled with them for years, and she said it held notes, sketches, and thoughts about the man who saved them. She said sometimes she wrote in it when she felt scared or unsure, and she said it helped her feel less alone. Daniel looked at the notebook with surprise, and he asked why she kept it for so long. Lila smiled softly and said some stories were not meant to end quickly. She said she believed she would meet him again one day, and she said the notebook helped her hold onto that belief. Daniel felt his eyes sting, but he kept his expression calm. Mira explained how life slowly improved after those difficult years. She said she found steady work, and she said she learned to stand on her own again. She said Lila grew strong and thoughtful, and she said her questions about the world kept her moving forward. She said even during the hardest times, they carried gratitude instead of bitterness, and that choice shaped who they became. Daniel shared pieces of his own life as well, and he admitted he chose quiet paths and simple routines. He said he avoided attention and deep connections, because he feared being needed again. He said helping them was the bravest thing he ever did, and also the most frightening, because it showed him what he was capable of. He said he stepped back into silence to protect himself from expectations he did not know how to meet. Mira responded with understanding, and she said fear often followed courage closely. She said people who helped others deeply often carried unseen weight afterward. She said she never blamed him for leaving, and she said she only wished he knew how much his actions mattered. Daniel felt a tension release from his shoulders as she spoke. The conversation moved gently between past and present, and time passed without anyone noticing. The tea cooled, but no one cared, because the warmth in the room came from something deeper. Lila asked about Daniel's work, his hobbies, and his daily life, and she listened with genuine interest. Daniel answered honestly, and for the first time in years, he felt seen without judgment. As night grew darker outside, Daniel realized he was no longer counting minutes. He felt grounded in the moment, and he understood that this meeting was not an interruption, but a continuation. Mira glanced at the clock and said they should leave soon, but her voice carried hesitation. Daniel surprised himself by asking them to stay a little longer. He said the night felt different, and he said he did not want to rush something that waited years to happen. Mira smiled gently, and Lila nodded eagerly. The silence between them returned briefly, but this time it felt calm and welcoming. Daniel looked at the folded letter on the table again, and he knew he would read it soon. He understood that part of healing meant facing words left unsaid. As they sat together, sharing space and breath, Daniel realized something important. Saving someone did not end with one action, and silence did not erase connection. Some bonds waited patiently for the right moment to speak again. Daniel finally reached for the folded letter, and his hands moved with care as if the paper could break. He looked at Mira and Lila, and both gave a small nod, giving him silent permission. He opened the letter slowly, and the sound of the paper unfolding felt loud in the quiet room. The letter was written in simple words, but every line carried deep feeling. Mira wrote about the fear she felt that night, and how close she came to losing everything she loved. She wrote about waking up later and realizing a stranger had risked himself for her and her child. She wrote about gratitude that never faded, even when life became hard again. Daniel read about the days after the accident, and how Mira struggled to rebuild stability. She wrote about moving often, taking any work she could find, and learning how to stay strong for Lila. She wrote that whenever she felt weak, she remembered the calm voice that told her child everything would be okay. She wrote that voice became her reminder to keep going. The letter also included words from Lila, written later when she was older. Lila wrote that she grew up believing courage was quiet and gentle. She wrote that she learned bravery did not always wear loud confidence. She wrote that the man who saved them showed her that fear and strength could exist together. Daniel felt his vision blur, but he continued reading until the end. When he finished, he placed the letter back on the table and pressed his palms together. He felt exposed in a way he never allowed himself before, but he also felt lighter. He realized the silence he chose carried more weight than he ever understood. Mira watched him closely and asked how he felt. Daniel answered honestly and said he felt seen for the first time in many years. He said he never allowed himself to accept gratitude, because he believed it came with responsibility he could not carry. He said the letter helped him understand that his actions mattered even if he disappeared afterward. Lila leaned forward and spoke softly. She said she used to imagine what kind of person Daniel was. She said sometimes she thought he might be a hero, and sometimes she thought he might be lonely. She said seeing him now made her realize he was simply human, and that made his choice even more meaningful. Daniel smiled faintly at her words and said he was lonely for a long time. He said he convinced himself that distance kept him safe. He said he avoided close bonds because he feared loss and expectation. He said meeting them again challenged that belief in a way he did not expect. Mira shared more about Lila's life, and she spoke with pride. She said Lila grew into someone who helped others naturally. She said Lila often stood up for people who felt unseen. She said the lesson from that night shaped her values quietly but deeply. Daniel listened and felt a sense of peace knowing that kindness continued beyond him. Lila then shared her own dreams and hopes. She said she wanted to work in a way that made people feel safe and understood. She said she believed small actions could change lives, even if they seemed ordinary at the time. Daniel felt humbled hearing her speak, because he saw how one moment created ripples far beyond his control. The conversation turned reflective, and Daniel found himself opening up more than usual. He shared how the accident stayed with him through years of quiet living. He said loud places and fast roads reminded him of that night. He said he carried guilt for leaving without checking back. Mira assured him again that she never blamed him, and she said survival often forced people into silence. As the hours passed, the weight in the room softened. Laughter appeared briefly when Mira shared a light memory from Lila's childhood. Daniel noticed how natural it felt to be part of a shared moment again. He realized connection did not always demand perfection or constant presence. Daniel admitted that meeting them gave him a chance to rewrite how he saw himself. He said he often viewed his life as small and unimportant. He said hearing their story made him realize even quiet lives could hold powerful meaning. Mira agreed and said impact was not measured by noise or recognition. Lila asked Daniel if he regretted helping them that night. Daniel answered without hesitation and said he never regretted it. He said he only regretted doubting himself afterward. He said fear stole years he could have spent living more openly. Lila nodded as if she understood deeply. The room grew still again, but this silence felt different. It felt like understanding rather than distance. Daniel looked at the clock and realized it was late, but he did not feel rushed. Mira mentioned they had a place to stay nearby, but her tone carried warmth instead of urgency. Daniel stood and offered to walk them part of the way when they were ready. He said he wanted to step outside with them, even if only for a short distance. Mira smiled and said she appreciated that. Lila gathered her notebook and placed it back in her bag carefully. As they prepared to leave, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He understood that this meeting was not an ending. It was a bridge between who he was and who he could become. He realized silence no longer served him the way it once did. They stood near the door, and Mira thanked Daniel again, not with heavy emotion, but with calm certainty. Lila looked up at him and said she was glad he opened the door that night and again now. Daniel nodded and felt warmth spread through him. As Daniel stepped outside with them, the cool night air touched his face. The street looked the same as before, but he felt different standing there. He understood now that some moments waited patiently to return. And when they did, they carried healing instead of fear. Daniel walked beside Mira and Lila down the quiet street, and the soft sound of their footsteps felt steady and calm. The street lights cast long shadows, and the night air carried a peaceful stillness that wrapped around them. Daniel realized he had avoided moments like this for years, moments where life moved slowly and meaningfully. Mira spoke about their journey to find him, and she said it took patience and belief. She said they followed small clues, asked careful questions, and trusted their instinct. She said many doors closed, but hope stayed open, even when answers were delayed. Daniel listened with respect, understanding how much effort stood behind this meeting. Lila walked between them and looked up at the sky, and she said she always believed the world had ways of bringing people together again. She said some connections did not disappear, even when time tried to erase them. Daniel smiled at her words, because they sounded wiser than her age. They reached the corner where their paths would separate, and Daniel felt a quiet pause settle between them. Mira thanked him once more, but this time her voice carried calm instead of emotion. She said this meeting helped her close a chapter she carried for years. She said knowing Daniel was safe and kind gave her peace. Daniel answered that meeting them helped him understand his own story better. He said he spent years believing silence was strength. He said now he understood that openness could also be a form of courage. Mira nodded, and her eyes reflected agreement. Lila stepped forward and hugged Daniel gently, and the gesture surprised him. He stood still for a moment, then returned the hug with care. He felt warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience in a long time. Lila stepped back and smiled, and her smile carried confidence and gratitude. They exchanged quiet goodbyes, and Mira and Lila walked toward their place, their figures slowly blending into the night. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, watching until they disappeared from view. He did not feel empty as they left. He felt complete. Daniel turned and walked back toward his house, and each step felt lighter than before. The street looked the same, but his perspective had changed. He noticed the trees, the windows, and the gentle hum of distant life. He realized he was no longer hiding from the world. When Daniel entered his house, the silence welcomed him differently. It no longer felt heavy or lonely. It felt calm and open. He sat on the sofa and looked at the letter once more, and he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer where it could stay safe. Daniel reflected on the years he spent avoiding connection, and he forgave himself for choices made out of fear. He understood now that survival shaped people in unexpected ways. He accepted that growth often came late, but it still mattered. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual, and sunlight filled the room gently. He made breakfast and opened the window, letting fresh air move through the space. He felt motivated to change small things, to live with intention instead of avoidance. Daniel decided to reconnect with the world slowly and honestly. He spoke more with neighbors, smiled more freely, and allowed conversations to last longer. He did not rush transformation, but he welcomed progress. Each day carried small shifts that added up. Weeks passed, and Daniel received a message from Mira. She shared that Lila started a new project at school, inspired by stories of quiet courage. She said Lila spoke about a moment that shaped her belief in kindness. Daniel read the message and felt proud, even though he never sought recognition. Daniel replied with simple words, expressing happiness and support. He did not feel pressure to be anything more than himself. He felt balanced, knowing connection did not demand perfection. Over time, Daniel kept the door of his life more open. He accepted invitations, shared meals, and allowed friendships to form naturally. He learned that trust could grow slowly without fear. One evening, Daniel stood at his door again, but this time he looked outward with ease. He understood that the past no longer controlled him. It informed him, guided him, and strengthened him. Daniel realized that saving someone once could echo through years in unexpected ways. He understood that silence could protect for a while, but truth healed deeper. He accepted that life offered second chances quietly, often when people least expected them. As Daniel closed the door that night, he did so with peace in his heart. He knew the knock that once changed his life did not bring fear. It brought closure, understanding, and renewal. And with that knowledge, Daniel moved forward, carrying gratitude instead of silence.